Well, good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics. This is your weekly in-depth look at the tropics, and this is week 25 of the hurricane season. It's 169 days old, and we're getting closer to the end. Thanksgiving is next week. The season ends on November 30th, but there are still two systems out there right now that have something to say about that end of the season. Iota made landfall as a Category 4 storm in Nicaragua yesterday and has since weakened to a tropical storm. We'll get to the latest on that system and potentially one right behind it. Yes, one right behind it in just a second. Plus, we'll head to Louisiana for a recap of the wild hurricane season that state has seen. They have set records down in Louisiana just like we have all across the Atlantic Basin. But let's first take you back to what was going on 24 hours ago. This is Category 4 Hurricane Iota prior to making landfall in Nicaragua down in Central America. I'll let the satellite go into motion, and you can see once it did move inland, it dissipated very quickly, really broke apart, unfortunately still spreading a lot of rain in parts of Central America. Tonight the center has moved into Honduras, again as a tropical storm. Remember, a very mountainous region, so it doesn't take long for systems down in Central America to dissipate and get torn apart, but not before doing a lot of damage. The very latest on Tropical Storm Iota now from the National Hurricane Center, 50-mile-an-hour winds. Again, it doesn't look like much, but still producing 50-mile-an-hour winds and gusting up to 70 miles per hour, moving to the west about 12 miles an hour. So, that's faster than some of the storms we've seen this year, but that's still, in the overall big picture, kind of slow and still capable of producing a lot of rain. We don't have radar down in that part of the world, but we all know that when we see clouds that intense that there's plenty of rain to go with it. And I went ahead and put this on here. Landfall of Iota yesterday, but 13 days ago on November 3rd, 15 miles away is where Iota made landfall. In fact, I've kind of done a close in, and this is just something amazing. We'll talk a little bit more about when we get to our Louisiana topic and the number of storms they've seen this year. But not only did you have two hurricanes within a short period of time, 2 weeks essentially, making landfall 15 miles apart, but they were two Category 4 hurricanes. That is something we just don't see. Hurricane Iota had 155-mile-per-hour winds when it made landfall. 13 days prior, Hurricane Iota had 140-mile-per-hour winds. So two Category 4 storms in one spot, 15 miles apart, 13 days apart. Now, the forecast track isn't that complicated. The system will rapidly fall apart and be non-tropical in a remnant low before we get into too far on Wednesday. But again, just moving into Honduras tonight with 50-mile-per-hour winds is Tropical Storm Iota. And this part of the world in November, it's no surprise that we're seeing a lot of activity. As we look at tropical storm and hurricane formation since 1851, so a lot of data here for the month of November, everywhere you see a dot is a place where either a tropical storm or hurricane formed. And notice where the cluster is. The cluster is in the Western Caribbean, where cold fronts usually don't get to this time of year. Cold fronts usually calm down the Gulf of Mexico in November. Cold fronts usually calm down and shut off the southeastern part of the United States and the Atlantic Ocean. But cold fronts generally don't shut down the Western Caribbean this year, so the few times that we do have storms form, and there have been a lot this year, over the years, a lot of them happen in the Western Caribbean, and a lot of them impact Central America. So it's no surprise this next phrase coming out of my mouth. There is another system potentially behind Hurricane Iota that could be forming. It really hasn't started to pull itself together yet, but over the course of the next few days, right around the Western Caribbean, in this area of shaded yellow, there is a 30% chance that a tropical system could pull itself together. So an area of low pressure, some developing thunderstorms over the next couple of days will pull themselves together and could form. But over the past 24 hours, this chance has went from 40% down to 30%. So to brush up on our Greek alphabet, next up on the list after we have now checked off 30 named storms after Iota would be Kappa. Of course, we all know these are names we have never had to use in our named hurricane history, but somewhere we continue to go right now. 30 named storms, an all-time record for the Atlantic Hurricane Basin. Again, these records go back to 1851. Unfortunately, our next guest has dealt with a lot of those storms this year. So let's bring in our guest tonight, KLFY's Heath Morton. We've talked to him several times throughout the hurricane season. And unfortunately, it's usually not for good reasons, Heath, but the state of Louisiana has been sort of a magnet this year. Let's kind of take a step back before we jump into this next system and kind of remind us what you guys have all lived through there in Louisiana.
Well, I have to go back to early June. Thanks for having me on, Wes. I appreciate it. But yes, we have to go way back over 5 months ago. Cristobal, which hit across the southeastern part of the state, is a tropical storm. And then we had, of course, a Laura that made landfall as a Category 4. Interestingly enough, we had Delta that hit about 12 miles away from where Laura did, and Delta was almost a major hurricane. Of course, Laura was. And then you go down into Nicaragua, where you had the hurricane 2 weeks ago. There was a Cat 4. This one, a Cat 4, that hit 12 miles apart. That was Ada, and then, of course, last night, Iota. So it's interesting that we've had two pretty big hurricanes, or four, I should say, that have hit in a very similar spot, one across Louisiana, or two across Louisiana, and then across Central America. And then after Laura, we had Delta, and then we had, looks like, after that, Delta, and then we had Ada. That made landfall. So, yeah, or Zeta, I should say. I'm getting them all confused now that we're in the Greek alphabet. Zeta that hit near New Orleans. So we've had 3 hurricanes that have hit somewhere across the state this year. 2 across the western parts, 1 across the eastern part. Folks are still, recovering. I still see a lot of roofers on roofs trying to get roofs back on, repairing roofs. There's still a lot of cleanup going on. And, of course, Delta hit. That was about 5 weeks ago. So still some recovery going on, but things are getting back to normal. But yeah, it's been a bad year for us. Hopefully we'll take a few years off from hurricane season, and maybe we won't see anything again for a very long time.
Right. Well, y'all deserve it, that's for sure. Iota, on top of everything else, the strongest hurricane we've seen all year, and it's the middle of November. Just an amazing statistic for this amazing season we've lived through. So Delta, your most recent one, kind of take us back. That's a great point about all these storms coming within a close amount of space in a close amount of time. But you guys hadn't really fully recovered or even gotten started after Laura before Delta hit. Talk to us about how that worked with back-to-back storms like that.
Right. Laura hit August 26th, and then Delta hit on October the 9th. So about, I would say 6 weeks, 5.5, 6 weeks apart they hit. So we hadn't fully recovered from Laura. Of course, Laura hit, like I said, 12 miles from where Delta did. And Delta was the Category 2 hurricane, Laura the Category 4, almost Category 5. And we had a lot more damage with Delta. It came a little bit closer to us after it came inland, and those winds really spread out inside of that storm. So we saw sustained winds across Acadiana anywhere from about, I would say, 60 to 90 miles per hour. For the first time, I had roof damage from any kind of tropical system on my roof, so I had to get that repaired. A lot of roof damage across the area, a lot of trees down, a lot more power outages with Delta. So it came in, and those winds really just spread out. But still, some folks were still having to deal with the mess from Laura. Then you had Delta that came in, of course. So Delta was worse for us, and someone told me that Delta was the worst damage he's ever seen in 50 years across this area. So it packed a punch, even though it was a weaker system than Laura. That's one thing that we have to look at, is how far those winds are going to spread out after it makes landfall, and that's what happened with Delta. With Laura, they were a little more compact in a smaller area, but we really saw widespread damage as Delta came in.
Heath, behind me, I'm showing our viewers here on Tracking the Tropics the 9 named storms that the Gulf of Mexico has had this year. I want to get back to that comment you made about the gentleman who said the worst he's seen in 50 years. We got to remind everyone, I mean, you guys had Camille in the 60s, you guys had Katrina and Rita back in 2005, and now these 2 storms. Do you think these storms, whether it be Laura or Delta or maybe the combination of both, are these going to be the new storms of record for your part of Louisiana?
Very possible. I mean, Laura was the strongest to hit in at least 150 years. You have to go back to the Civil War time. We had that Lost Island storm that hit. Supposedly it had winds at about 155, 160. But Laura, I'm sure the strongest it's hit Louisiana since records have been kept, or especially in Imai's lifetime here. And then Delta was similar to Lily back in 2002. It did a lot of damage, but like I said, some folks have told me it was worse than Lily, a little stronger than Lily, but it was a little farther west of us. But the impacts are pretty incredible. So yeah, these are two storms that will go down in Louisiana history as some of the strongest to hit, I'm pretty sure. And it's been a long time since we've seen a big hurricane hit to the west. Rita hit in 2005, hit right along the state line. The last two hit a little farther east of there. So it's been a long time since we've had hurricanes this strong hit across that part of the state.
And we should remind people, the map behind me now, everyone's looking at, Heath, 12 U.S. landfalls this year. And we're talking about all these historic storms for Louisiana. Let's remind people, they're probably thinking, what about Katrina? Katrina was only 2 or 3, and that was kind of a different ball game with flooding. So we're not forgetting Katrina, but we're talking more southwest Louisiana, and Katrina wasn't a Cat 4 or 5.
Right, I think it was a Cat 3 at landfall. It clipped the extreme southeastern parts, the Grand Isle area, I think winds at 130. And, what was so notable about that is after it made landfall, of course, we saw the levee break. And that's when, you had all the devastation, because there really wasn't a lot of wind damage in New Orleans. A lot of that was in Mississippi, southern Mississippi. So, but what got the attention and the national attention was all the flooding because of the levee break. And if the levee wouldn't have broke, then it probably wouldn't have seemed as bad. But Laura was actually a stronger hurricane at landfall than Katrina. And like you said, these two made landfall across the southwestern parts of the state. Of course, Katrina was farther east. And we were worried with Delta. At one time, it was showing a Cat 3 or 4 coming right up through our area, right through the middle of Vermilion Bay. And that's always been a big fear, that you get a 3 or 4, maybe 5 that comes up Vermilion Bay, because it would probably carry water all the way up as north as I-10. So we were a little concerned about that with Delta, but it went a little farther west, but it did make landfall as a Category 2. So we've been fortunate and did not have a direct hit here right in our area, but still we've been close enough to deal with the major impacts with some of these storms.
And Heath, of course, joining us tonight from Lafayette, Louisiana. It's kind of in between the Texas-Louisiana border and New Orleans, for those of you not familiar. Heath, I'll get you out of here on this, and I want to bring in a coronavirus analogy, because I think at this point, 9 months into this pandemic, and people are getting tired of social distancing and tired of wearing the mask. It's getting old. Were people getting tired of preparing for hurricanes, and do you think that led to any more damage or lives lost when Delta came along after Laura? Were people tired of it?
That's a very good point, because, with Laura, it seemed like the preparation was a little better. I think people were just kind of tired, and they don't want to have to deal with another one. So when Delta came along, it was weaker, but still, like I said, we had more damage from it. With those very strong winds that were more spread out inside the storm. So yes, I didn't hear near as much about Delta as I did with Laura. Laura seemed to get a lot more hype. Of course, it was a stronger storm, but I think at that point people were kind of over it. We were into October. You still had the COVID stuff going on. We had just dealt with a hurricane 5-6 weeks earlier. So I think people were just kind of, I'm going to ride this out, and I'm not going anywhere. And unfortunately, we did have more damage with it. Now, we didn't have, injuries. As far as I know, we didn't have any deaths from winds or anything like that. But we did have more damage from trees over, power lines down, power outages, and of course, we had a lot of roof damage. That was the main thing: roof damage and a lot of fences blown over.
Heath, Thanksgiving is next week. I hope that this is the last time that you and I have to talk this year, but an amazing season. And Heath Morton down in Lafayette, Louisiana at KLFY, thanks so much for sharing some time with us tonight.
Thanks for having me. Hopefully we are done with the Gulf of Mexico. It's late in the season already. As far as I know, we've never had a landfalling hurricane in Louisiana in November, and I hope that streak continues. But yeah, until next season, you know, hopefully it'll be a quiet 2021. But right now, it's hard to say. If we get El Nino in here,
yep,
it could be quieter. But right now, it's hard to say. And folks are asking me about it, and I'm like, it's just, I don't want to think about it yet. Give me maybe to March or April, and we'll start talking about that.
Yeah, let's get some vacation time in. Let's walk away. Let's talk about snow or something else other than the tropics. But excellent stuff. Great perspective down in South Louisiana. That's Heath Morton. Heath, good to be with you tonight.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right, Heath mentioned, I'll just chime in, you know, this has been a La Nina year. The Pacific Ocean does different things from time to time, warms and cools, and in La Nina years, there is less wind in the upper atmosphere. There's more that allow tropical systems to form in La Nina years. This is a La Nina year. So the opposite of that, El Nino, usually prohibits, holds back the tropical season. So when we say, hey, we're all hoping for an El Nino, that would generally mean less tropical activity. And we need less tropical activity, again, after 9 named storms in the Gulf of Mexico and after a record-setting 12 U.S. landfalls across from South Texas all the way up to Faye. Remember, made it all the way up to the New England area. So quite a season it has been. So let's kind of summarize some of these records, and then we're going to end on a lighter note. I promise you that. So here are the records that we are breaking or flirting with. Number of named storms in the Atlantic Basin, 30. We broke that record, which we all know back in 2005 had 28. 2005 was the Katrina Rita year. As far as number of hurricanes, we've had 13 hurricanes so far. 2005 had 15, so we're in second place there. When it comes to major hurricanes, thanks to Iota becoming a Cat 5, major hurricane category 3, 4, or 5, 2020 has 6 major hurricanes. That's second place when 2005 had 7. So it's kind of an on and off again competition with 2005, a competition that none of us want. And as far as U.S. landfalls, I just showed you that map, there have been 12. 1916 had 9, so we were really breaking some history there as far as U.S. landfalls. A couple other notes I wanted to pass along. This is the most amazing statistic that I think what's happened the last 2 months. So Iota was the latest Cat 5 in the season we've ever had. Iota was also the first Greek name to reach Cat 5, and that makes sense because we've only had 2 other seasons where we've used the Greek letter. Here's the most amazing statistic. The first 24 named storms of the season, we had 2 major hurricanes. 24 to get 2. Well, the last 6 named storms have produced 4 major hurricanes. So 24 to get 2 or 6 to get 4. That is an amazing end to this hurricane season. One that started on June 1st, one that ends in a little less than 2 weeks on November 30th. It peaked on September 10th. This graph shows tropical activity over the years, and I'm happy to report that we are on the downswing. We are close to the end officially of the hurricane season. Now remember though, there have been times throughout history where some December storms have formed, but very seldom do they ever interact with the United States. Again, cold fronts are our friends this time of year. Helps push storms out to sea, helps cool the atmosphere, helps cool the water. So that's why we typically don't get them, and that's why November at only 5% is the lowest amount of activity in the Atlantic hurricane season when you look at the month. The most popular month, the most busy month is September. At 34% of our tropical activity comes in September. All right, enough numbers, enough records. On a lighter note, let me set a different scene for you. Imagine some faces pressed against the glass, a few young kids peeking over the rail, fans waiting and watching as a lion and a lioness were released back into their habitat after Hurricane Delta ravaged Louisiana. Maya Hudgens takes it from here.
faces pressed up against the glass and peeking over the rail, all waiting for Rocco the lion and Sophia the lioness to be released back into their habitat after being in their night homes for 4.5 weeks.
During the hurricane, a huge tree fell right on this corner of their enclosure, crushed it to the ground, did significant damage, and it took some time to get it all put back together.
And the excitement could be heard miles away.
They just bolted out the doors as soon as the doors were open and had a good time. They had to kind of check everything out, even though this has always been their enclosure. It looked a little different, it smelled different, so again, they had to check things out.
Inside their newly rebuilt home, the lions found pumpkins, grass, and toys to enjoy. Zoo officials say they could see the excitement from the lions, and getting them back into their night homes tonight might be a little difficult.
Yeah, definitely they need a big enclosure. Obviously it has to be tall. This is 16 feet high, has 2 hot wires, so they can't climb out. It's pretty substantially built, I might add, as well. And it has to be because these are very powerful animals.
In Monroe, Maya Hudgens, NBC 10, your local news leader.
All right, Maya, never seen so many humans so excited to see a lion before, but just proof that hurricanes impact all species. And guess what? That's it for us tonight on this Tuesday evening. It's a week before Thanksgiving. Thank you for spending part of your night here on Tracking the Tropics. For Heath, for myself, for everyone involved behind the scenes, I'm Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina. Have a great night.